Hi people, Charles Chabert here, urologist and director of prostates.com.au. What I wanted to do with today's blog was to highlight for you some of the changes that have happened over the last few years with regards how we test and screen for prostate cancer and how that process has evolved more recently. So if we take a step back a few years ago, the way that this process would begin would be with a blood test, or the PSA, which stands for prostatic specific antigen. So an individual would have the blood test done by their local physician, and if there was an abnormality of that test, they'd be referred to see their local urologist. On review of that blood test, a recommendation might be made to proceed on with a transrectal prostate biopsy. So that is a procedure whereby the urologist aims to try and get some tissue within the prostate to try and establish whether or not there are any abnormal cells or if there was a diagnosis of prostate cancer. Now, the issue with that test is that it really reflects quite random sampling within the prostate. It's done in a blind fashion, so we have a standard template, if you like, which means that we access different areas within the prostate, not knowing if any of those areas are actually involved with foci of prostate cancer. The downside to that is that there is a significant risk of infection, and what we have seen with studies over the last few years is that the risk of infection after biopsies of this type is increasing. And part of the problem that we have with that is that if an individual does get a nasty infection, it can be more resistant to standard antibiotics, and that's certainly something that we have seen. So more recently, when we follow the evolutionary path of a biopsy, we can see that in certain centers, biopsies are done by placing the needle rather than through the back passage. The needle is placed through the skin, called the perineum, the skin between the back of the scrotum and the back passage. Now, the aim of that process is to minimize the risk of infection, and certainly large studies around the world do demonstrate that with transcutaneous or biopsies through the skin, there is a reduction in the risk of an infection. Okay, so more recently we have had the advent of MRI scans for trying to get an image inside the prostate. The scan, the official name for the scan, is called a multiparametric MRI, and in essence what that means is that we look at different aspects of the MRI. We look at an image, we look at density patterns throughout the prostate, and we also have a look at perfusion or blood flow within the gland as well to try and get an idea if we think, A, is there a spot within the prostate, and if there is a spot within the prostate, does it look suspicious? And then on the basis of that, if an individual does need to go ahead and have a biopsy, well, we can do that biopsy once again in a transperineal approach so that we avoid passing a needle through the back passage. Now, there are studies from Europe and a pivotal study from Australia that does demonstrate the utility of doing an MRI, i.e. that it's a very accurate tool. It's more accurate than doing a blind transrectal biopsy. So at the moment, part of the issue that we have with MRI is, yes, it's a great tool, however, it still is relatively expensive, and in Australia it will cost on average $500 to say $550 out of pocket for an individual to have that scan. Ultimately, however, what we're trying to achieve is a process whereby we can be more selective about who has a biopsy rather than subjecting men to non-directed random transrectal biopsies with the potential sequelae of infection from that. So to recap, really what we've seen over the last few years is an evolution in how we try to work up an individual who does have an abnormal blood test, and certainly multiparametric MRI testing is becoming a standard tool really that we are using to evaluate the individual who does have a high PSA. I hope this helps, hope it answers some of your questions. If you do have any questions for me, please respond and post those questions down below, or you can always get us at Twitter, which is at Dr. C. Chabert. Hope this helps, and look forward to seeing you next time.